Good evening. Welcome. We are still having a few people join, but I'm excited to be amongst you all and talking about this incredibly important concept. So I want to get started. My name is Barbara Brown Wilson. I am an associate professor of urban and environmental planning and also the current faculty director of the Equity Center here at UVA, and very proud to be amongst my colleagues at the School of Architecture. Thank you to Sneha Patel for being the creative director and all things magical and technological happening for us and with us. And thank you to Alan Simpson, who is representing the Student Planning Association, and really grateful to have students who care about these important issues. And tonight we're super excited because we get to be alongside our colleagues at the Charlottesville Low-Income Housing Coalition and the Public Housing Association of Residents, who are represented by our colleague Brandon Collins. Brandon is a lead organizer for FAR and a member of CLIHC, Public Housing Association of Residents, Charlottesville Low-Income Housing Coalition. He's a lifelong resident of Charlottesville, and he's worked for the past 9 years as an organizer, organizing residents at FAR to improve policies and quality of life, advocating for affordable housing for extremely low-income renters, and spearheading FAR's redevelopment efforts, which I'm sure you'll get to hear about tonight. And previous to his work with FAR, Collins has been an activist in immigration, ecology, labor, housing, and anti-war movements, and he currently serves on the Regional Housing Partnership. Thank you so much for being here, Brandon. And then we have two national experts that are also, people I really look up to, as well as my local expert. So Dr. Willow Lung-Amam is an associate professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland, College Park, and director of community development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education. She researches issues of urban and suburban inequality, particularly redevelopment, gentrification, racial segregation, immigration, neighborhood opportunity, and she's the author of Trespassers, Asian American and the Battle for Suburbia, and a forthcoming book on redevelopment politics and equitable development, organizing in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Thank you so much for being with us. And also Dr. Kate Howell, Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning in the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University and co-director of the RVA Eviction Lab. Kate has a wealth of knowledge coming from both a world of working in DC before doing research. I was lucky enough to have Kate as a colleague when we were in grad school together. So it's super fun that we still get to be neighbors. And I would love for you each to get the floor for a few minutes to do the less awkward introduction, to talk about what you do and how you really see your work as situated within this larger context of housing justice, just to give us kind of set the stage for the words we're using tonight and why they matter. Brandon, since you have the local knowledge that's going to ground us, will you start us off?
Sure. Well, I'm Brandon. I'm from Charlottesville. Lived here my whole life, raising a family here, and I've always felt like Charlottesville had potential. As I was growing up as a white guy, was pretty much oblivious to our terrible racist past of the city and oblivious to, our current racist situation. It wasn't until much later in life that I kind of realized that about my hometown. As I was being involved in activism, I realized that my home is here in Charlottesville, and public housing really is ground zero for making significant changes in the world. And I think Charlottesville in particular is an amazing starting point. So a little bit of background about Charlottesville. Colonized, natives dispersed, enslaved people brought in, Thomas Jefferson's plantation, who was also a founder of this new country that also needed a new economy. And he was a big proponent of the plantation system. And you know, a lot of that got born out of Charlottesville, even though he wasn't such a great plantation owner, not to mention a pretty terrible human being as it came to how he treated the world around him. And, you know, after the Civil War, Charlottesville actually had a very large Black population for a little bit of time. And over time, it slimmed down, and we're currently about 18% African-American people in Charlottesville. But over that 100 years between the end of the Civil War and the 1960s, the Black community was fairly self-sufficient. It didn't have tons of resources, but it did have community, it had politics, it had spirituality, it had its own economics. And like a lot of places around the country, urban renewal came through. And that happened in Charlottesville at the same time as school desegregation was going on. And we had this bonus thing where there were referendums on whether to have urban renewal, whether to have public housing, whether to have a housing authority, where to put the public housing. It was a very ugly, fractured fight in this town in the early 60s. Nevertheless, urban renewal happened here in Charlottesville. Vinegar Hill was not only a place where the Black community lived, but it was also the main economic business district for the Black community in Charlottesville. And then a number of years later, similarly, there was an urban renewal effort at Garrett Street. And there was a giant road built through Hartman's Mill. All of these are places where public housing now stands because, like everywhere else in the country, not everywhere, but a lot of places, in order to do urban renewal, they had to relocate people. And that's how public housing authorities were born in a lot of places. And that's how it happened here in Charlottesville. So all that was bulldozed, literally, and sat vacant for a very long time. And all the community got for their sort of theft of their economics and their political life, their social life, their power in their communities was public housing. And that is kind of the approach that we take at my organization. So I work for FARD, Public Housing Association of Residents. We're the resident council and resident advisory board in Charlottesville. We're governed entirely by low-income residents of public housing. And we've been a fairly influential organization. I think one of the biggest steps our organization took was in 2009, as conversations about redevelopment were occurring, we pushed for what's called a Residents' Bill of Rights for Redevelopment. And it was the first of its kind in the country. And it carries with it one-for-one replacement, the right to return, that this should provide economic advancement, and other protections. This was agreed to by the city and by the housing authority, and that was brought forward by FAR. That Bill of Rights has almost made itself into federal law when it comes to certain HUD programs and things like that. We feel pretty good about that. And moving on from there, you know, there were attempts at redevelopment in Charlottesville, but it never really went anywhere. There were a lot of bad ideas. There was a lot of the engagement with residents was really pie in the sky thinking that was never backed up by money, and never really able to be realized. And it wasn't until after we had fought and pushed back against a lot of bad ideas that we said, we need this. We need redevelopment. Things are crumbling. The situation is terrible. We're going to present our own vision. And we went out and developed the positive vision for redevelopment with residents of public housing. And as I was explaining before the call, we came up with principles to begin with. And one of those principles was that because of how poorly communities have been treated in Charlottesville, not just urban renewal, not just enslavement, but also the drug war, disinvestment, all these things, that Charlottesville really owes the community. And instead of just having a duty to maintain these houses, they actually need to have some sense of payback and some piece of amends. It's not going to be all of the amends in Charlottesville, but we think it's a big piece because what the community was given was public housing, and that is a vehicle by which we can make some amends. So that's the approach we've taken. We've been wildly successful. We participate deeply in the conversation about expanding affordable housing for extremely low income people in this town. And I think we've been effective, and we're growing, and hopefully once again be a model for the rest of the country.
Yeah, I am certainly inspired by all you all are doing in public housing and through CLIHC. So thank you so much for that. Proud to be living here with you all. Maybe we'll go to Dr. Howell next, since she's our neighbor, closest neighbor, and then in more ever so slightly farther away to Dr. Lung-Amam.
Great, thanks. So I feel like I went from, I don't know, it's hard. I feel like that was a tough act to follow, to say like, oh yeah, we're just playing around with some data over in Richmond. So feels a little bit of a tough one, but I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at the RVA Eviction Lab. So we are a community responsive data lab that's housed in the Wilder School at VCU. And so what that means is that we see data as a tool for community power and community decision-making. And so, which is ultimately a tool towards housing justice, because one of the big pieces that we see is that there's sort of data inequality that, you know, in the case of evictions, for example, landlords know everything about you, absolutely everything there could be to know about you, but you don't even know who the landlord is, much less how they've behaved, what their record is as a building owner. So I'm actually gonna pop our more recent website in the, that's like kind of our old website. I'll pop it in the chat so you can check out what we've been doing. So we sort of see that if you can kind of get a sense of, you know, what's going on in your community, there's more opportunity for holding folks accountable, for directly intervening, for organizing. And so we have sort of different constituencies. I think what people tend to see publicly is what we do in terms of reporting. We do quarterly reports on eviction filings sort of across the state, actually, or I guess the Commonwealth. And so that's kind of our thing that happens. And we do some other reports that tend to go for decision makers and sort of advocates at the state level, advocates at the local level. But less visible is what we do in terms of providing data to our community partners on the ground level in Richmond. And so, for example, because we have a database that kind of we went from, instead of trying to figure out state level eviction data, which is actually at the zip code level, which is not particularly helpful, other than to say like, look, there's a thing, which is not particularly useful if you're trying to actually do something. We said, okay, well, why don't we start from the building and go backwards from there. And so we started to look at the building to figure out common ownership, so that if, for example, if someone is having a trouble with their landlord at one building, they would email us sometimes, be like, hey, what else does this person own? And so we would kind of give them a list, and they would start organizing in all of those buildings and see what's going on common across the space. For the city of Richmond, we were also able to find out financing, which became really important when the CARES Act passed this time last year, or a little bit later than this time last year, because anything that was financed through the federal government was subject to the CARES Act, which meant that they had forbearance and therefore were not allowed to evict anyone. So we were able to create a list immediately for our community partners who were able to then go out with tenants and say, hey, actually, you cannot evict me. So this was before any of the moratoria came in, which was sort of a great direct piece. But so that's kind of given us a lot of pieces, and we pulled that together with eviction data. So we're able to kind of get a landlord level eviction rate. And so we kind of know who's doing the evicting. And so we get requests from folks all over the state who are doing organizing about that. But we also do sort of larger research projects based on questions that people ask us. So, I mean, this is where all this data was coming from in the first place. With people way back when we kind of started this in 2018, they're like, but who's doing the evicting? Who's doing the evicting? And the nearly national data set that Desmond put together at Princeton was great, but it couldn't tell you any of that. Couldn't tell you the types of landlords that were doing the evicting. And so, we started out with those questions, which led us to the database. And then people were asking sort of, what's going on, and more frequent reporting. And so we started to do the quarterly reports that we do. We've done a few other reports like that. So we've been really sort of partner driven in terms of our research. As my colleague Ben Teresa and I like to say, there are a lot of ways to do publications. This isn't the easiest, but this is definitely the way that we think we should be doing our job as responsible community members and as folks who have access to data and resources. And so we should be sharing those publicly. So that's been a lot of what we do. And we actually are working to partner with the Equity Center, which is super exciting. Fingers crossed for that. But I think, it's been really key for us. And again, because for us, thinking about housing justice is thinking about power, and data is a space of power. And so being able to kind of transfer that to a group that typically hasn't had access to data and are often just sort of told, this is who you are because I have all this information about you, being able to actually turn it around and say, no, this is who you are and this is who we are. I think that's really an important power play from our perspective.
That's fabulous. Dr. Lung-Amam?
Sure, thank you. 2 hard acts to follow. I know Kate very well and her work, and I know the work of the Eviction Lab, and it's such powerful work that's happening. So I am also kind of a data person, a community engaged researcher, a scholar, a teacher. I teach on issues of inequality in urban planning and community development. I'm also, as Barbara said, the Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education, which is a 4-school center on our campus that pulls researchers from across campus around issues of smart growth, which is not a term that we like to use very much anymore, but we sort of think about it as smart and equitable growth. And the ways that communities can grow more equitably as they grow more prosperous. And so through both of my hats, both as a scholar and the university generally, and through my role at the center, I've done a lot of community-based projects, a lot of projects partnering with county and state agencies around any number of equitable growth related or equitable redevelopment challenges that communities face. In my own research, a lot of it has centered on issues of neighborhood change and gentrification and the communities that are most impacted and most marginalized through those processes. My first book that Barbara mentioned was looking at Asian immigration in the Silicon Valley, and in a relatively prosperous area of the Valley, how the politics around housing and schools and even mall redevelopment, sort of thought about the place of Asian Americans, how it oftentimes marginalized them in the process, and through policies of redevelopment that were ultimately adopted in this relatively prosperous community. My second book project is centered in the Washington, D.C. area, and thinking about, again, suburbs, because suburbs really are the space of change and a lot of demographic change in a lot of our metropolitan areas as gentrification has hit the core in many areas. Many lower income communities, many minorities, many immigrant communities are increasingly locating to the suburbs. But these are also places that are rapidly redeveloping, just as cities are. And a lot of particularly inner ring suburbs are getting major reinvestment. And there's questions about equitable redevelopment, who benefits, who loses in the process. How do we think about affordable housing or commercial space in a suburban environment? So I've thought about it a lot in the context of suburbs. Also through the work and through partnerships at the center, I've done a lot on sort of thinking about housing policy through the lens of, quote unquote, opportunity mapping and opportunity neighborhoods, and, the frameworks in which are often are increasingly being adopted to sort of think about the location of affordable housing across a region and what an equitable distribution looks like, and how do we frame our policies to sort of think about where affordable housing should be located. And increasingly, I'm doing a lot of work on commercial displacement, small business displacement as associated with and not as exclusionary of affordable housing, because we also know that when neighborhoods gentrify, it's not just affordable housing that's lost and residents that are lost, but also the small businesses and the owners of those small businesses, the workers in those small businesses, the jobs and the vitality that they bring to local communities. So those are some of the touch points to our conversation today.
Thank you so much. And perhaps we'll do the same cycle. So Brennan, I'd love to hand you back the baton to talk a little bit about the affordable housing plan, what the sort of coalition is really envisioning what housing justice might look like in Charlottesville.
There are a lot of voices, and I certainly, so far, who I work for is the Resident Council. We're a founding member of the Charlottesville Low-Income Housing Coalition. We realized many years ago there wasn't any real organized approach on housing, and we said, you know what, we know a lot of stuff. Let's start a committee, and we did, and eventually it became CLIHC, which is awesome because CLIHC does a lot of work, and some of the data that Kate was talking about has actually been really helpful to CLIHC. But mainly what we do is we try to include as many affected people as possible with the coalition, and there's a number of things we want to do. One is supporting resident self-determination over their neighborhoods, making sure that people have a voice in policy decisions and planning decisions, not just in public housing. The city is going through a major look at a housing policy and a housing chapter of their strategic plan or their comprehensive plan, but also an actual housing strategy. And they've hired consultants. It's taken a long time to get there. And so making sure that especially African-American people, especially extremely low-income people, that is people under 30% AMI, which in Charlottesville, if you don't know, area median income right now has gone up to like $90,000 for a family of four. Our folks in public housing, the majority earn less than $20,000 per year. And people really need public housing. I mean, it's not just public housing, it's all over town. So making sure those folks are getting involved and addressing the question of gentrification. For a long time, the people who really make these decisions would just push back and say, oh, it's not really gentrification going on. Okay, whatever, you know, so we call it displacement, but it's the same thing. And also pushing back against dilution of communities, whereby you deconcentrate poverty by bringing in more people to help pay to build new stuff. What it usually means is there's less poor people in that neighborhood, and that neighborhood that was previously a Black neighborhood is now a white business district with, you know, fancy cupcake shops and stuff. So those are the issues we're working on. We presented a study through CLIHC about racism and housing in Charlottesville. We are very much inspired by Jordy, who's here today, who's done an amazing job tracking racial covenants throughout Charlottesville's history and comparing that to our zoning map and finding out they're pretty much the same thing. So that's a very large interest of CLIHC's and of FAR's to make sure that information gets out there and really build community support for an approach to funding affordable housing for extremely low income people. Not just saying it, not just building the easy 60% and below LIHTC things, but actually investing in something and changing the situation, telling the story of how racist our town has been and what needs to happen. And lastly, it's putting residents in the driver's seat for redevelopment. We call it resident-directed redevelopment. It's a type of self-determination. It's an ongoing process. We've had amazing success at South First Street. It started off with senior citizens and people with disabilities at a high rise, talking about their renovations and how that would go. And we've developed a process that I think the entire country could mimic. And we're doing that in partnership with the Housing Authority, who has embraced the idea that they were a major reason why land was stolen from the Black community, why the Black community has been dispersed. And they acknowledge that. They acknowledged that at a groundbreaking ceremony recently. So we value that partnership, and we really want to move that forward.
Thanks so much, Brandon. It would be great if Kate and Willow, you all could bring in the rest of the country. What's happening, other places that that either Charlottesville can learn from, or you know, what are the tools in this toolkit of housing justice?
I'm gonna let our resident housing policy expert go first.
Oh, is that me? I mean, I think that it's really interesting when you think about, I mean, I will pull from what Brandon just said, which is really important. And I think that it has to go back to, from a housing perspective, it really needs to go back to self-determination. Because, you know, it's not housing justice if we say, well, here's a policy and it's what we think you should do, and we're going to call it reparations, you're welcome. That's just sort of a housing program that's targeted. And that's very different. I think we have to really rethink not just what we do, but how we do it and why. And I think, you know, the policies that are out there that are, and there aren't very many, quite frankly, that are actually trusting residents that they know what they want for their lives. I think those are the ones that are going to end up ultimately being actually reparative. So I mean, I guess that's a roundabout way of saying there aren't a lot of examples. And I think, you know, there are ways in which we do self-determination. And I think, you know, obviously the Residents' Bill of Rights for redevelopment, I think is really an exciting move. And it's definitely something I hope gets sort of taken down the road a few miles east to Richmond, because I think that would be really powerful. But I also, I mean, I personally, this is, you know, because my other hat or my other sort of background is doing housing research in Washington, D.C., particularly around affordable housing preservation. And I actually think that affordable housing preservation can be a real tool towards housing justice. And I think I loved the idea of public housing as a vehicle for reparations. I think, you know, you take what you've got in the moment, right? And I think housing in general, depending on how you do it, can be really powerful. And so by housing preservation, I really mean sort of maintaining affordability in the way that residents want to maintain affordability. So that could mean that they all stay in place and they all sort of, you do repairs in the building, and that's great. It may involve working with residents to determine how they want to redevelop, right? Because there are repairs that are so great at this point that it's really difficult to actually do them. But at the end of the day, it has to start with those who actually have the lived experience in the community. And I think that's what ultimately we need to be looking at in terms of housing justice is how are we affirming people's right to be in their community? So how are we affirming people's right to determine their futures, regardless of income? And so that's something that I really think is huge. And I mean, so Washington, D.C., for example, all tenants have the right of first refusal when their building is sold. And so that means that, if a landlord says, hey, I'm selling the building, they have to notify the tenants, and the tenants can actually turn around and say, hey, but we want to buy it, or we actually know who we want to buy it. And there's a whole timeline, and the District of Columbia has more than $100 million every year in their local trust fund. So that actually facilitates a lot of tenant purchases or tenants deciding who will purchase it and under what terms they purchase it. So that involves maintaining affordability, addressing the structure of the building, who moves in, who doesn't. If tenants buy it, in many cases, they turn it into a limited equity cooperative. So it's an affordable ownership model. And I think that's another way of really thinking about being creative with our models of housing. But I think particularly, I mean, limited equity cooperatives aren't for everybody, but I think it is a way of decommodifying housing. Similarly, community land trusts can be a similar way of doing that. But I do think that the power of facilitating tenants doing what they need for their lives, right? The more tenants I interview, the more people I'm always amazed by, everyone sort of the balancing act folks do in their lives to make it work. They know what they want. They know what they need. It's not a big secret. And I think that we often, as policy people and decision makers, tend to like to make decisions for people based off of a whole bunch of research that we think is right, but doesn't necessarily match up with the lived experience. And I'll shut up now because that was a lot of talking.
No, I think Kate is right on point, and so is Brandon. Letting residents lead and tell you what it is they want and need. What is affordable, right? I mean, we talk about affordable as if it's a known quantity and we can just calculate it, as Brandon is saying, according to AMI, and that it works for everyone. It doesn't work for everyone. It's not hitting the bottom. And even when we go into that threshold of below the 30%, there's a lot of variety of, in that quantum too. So we need to really think about defining affordability based upon what is really affordable to people, given the cost of what they have. And I also think we need to separate out these discussions about housing justice versus reparations. I think reparations is a part of a housing justice platform, but it is not the equivalent. These are not equivalent conversations. Housing justice, in my mind, are policies that press for a more equitable distribution, more of housing across the region, of affordable housing, things that help to make the product as well as the process of deciding about those distributions more equitable. Part of that is repairing the damage that has been done in the housing field, particularly for African Americans. And we could spend the rest of the evening talking about all the damage that has been done through federal policy, through state level policy, through local level policy, through real estate agents, through banks. We've just scraped the surface in terms of mentioning redlining. and urban renewal and racial covenants, right? I mean, these are things that have happened in almost every community across the United States, and we've never repaired, quantified, or even tried to get at a real reparative framework for sort of thinking about that damage. I think those conversations are just starting to happen. As Kate mentioned, they're not, what is being called housing reparations right now is not housing reparations. If we were to try to quantify how much has been lost in African-American households because of these series of policies, highway clearance, slum clearance, evictions, and we were to try to quantify that, it would be a lot more than $400,000, which is what Evanston is now proposing for African-American families. That is affecting, I think, like 16 families right now in Evanston. I mean, we don't even have the frameworks in place for even having those conversations. We don't have people at the table to be having those the right people at the table. So I think we do have a lot of policies that can move towards a more just housing framework. TOPA, as Kate mentioned, rent control, we have cooperatives, we have lots of different things that community land trust that can help us build more equity into the process. But I don't think that we need to be thinking about these as reparative processes, but they could be used for reparative purposes. And I think we need some really strong examples of those, and we don't yet have them. So for those who are, reading the news right now and looking at Asheville, North Carolina, or Evanston as the examples of what is possible for reparative housing, I think we need to think bigger and push for much more than that.
Well, I think it also has to be national, right? I mean, I think that the local level, I mean, I think it's great, good try, but I don't think that we can really have this conversation without really explaining the national implication of, devaluing human beings and taking labor. I mean, and the degree to which our country is built on that. And so we aren't having that conversation nationally, and the fact that the whole sort of system was built on that, we expanded based on that. And I think that's the part that kind of gets me, hung up a little bit on the local efforts, is that we never are going to have the money, nor are we going to really have the major conversations that need to happen if we don't take it nationally.
I think there are some things going on locally here and some other places that, you can look and see where national policy and national resources could make a difference if that was provided to all communities. Money is the biggest piece. I think, one thing that we've had a lot of success with is we've got a contract with the Housing Authority and our developer partners that gives us a majority vote as the resident council. Now, could we transform that into a community development corporation? We totally could. The policy on right of first refusal, that could be extended into different circumstances. Our friends in Chicago used that in an amazing way, basically compelled the Housing Authority, because they hadn't offered that, compelled them to have to do business with a resident community development corporation at Cabrini Green. And while, some of that land has yet to be developed, residents have very much strong control over that, and they get the developers' fees when they're doing those projects. You can build wealth for a community through some of this stuff. I think you could see how HUD might be able to have some kind of influence on changing this dynamic and moving towards allowing self-determination. And I think the country's ready for it. If you look at the polling, before the presidential election, people talk about housing. You know, the candidates didn't really. Biden did mention universal vouchers, which is amazing. I got deep problems with Section 8 program generally, but we don't have to get into that. You know, the entire country's thinking about it, and we're on the verge of an intense eviction crisis and foreclosure crisis. So everybody's feeling it, and maybe this is the time to get those policies that are going to help communities and resource those communities and those policies. Chicago's done amazing things. They've been a real inspiration to us. But I do think it's about giving people power, paying them the money that you owe them in various forms. Sometimes maybe that's a direct check. Maybe that's just giving the land back, you know, but power and resources and knowing how to utilize that power and resources, I think is super key. Jordy's done a lot of, hopefully is going to do a lot of work on quantifying in Charlottesville, you know, what may have been lost.
Yeah, maybe we'll get him to join us at some point during this call. We'll
Yeah,
see if he
I'd
decides to stop being shy.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about so we can see what is falling short, and we've got a good lay of the land on you know, what are the places where there's inspiration for something that might approximate housing justice. What are the challenges when you do try to where have you seen this work be attempted, and what should Charlottesville be looking out for or anticipate as far as challenges go? Maybe we'll start national, and then Brandon will tell us if you all have looked in your crystal ball properly to you know, what he's experiencing on the ground. What is the resistance nationally to this type of policy?
Well, housing is usually adopted at the local level, but there's a lot that can be, as Kate was saying, done at the national level, right? And there is actually the Biden administration has, I would say, not as sophisticated, but there's a lot in Biden does have a housing plan, and he has a lot in it. And if we could figure out how to do what he's sketched out in very broad terms on the ground in 4 years, it would be a major victory towards a more just housing system. So, you know, I do think there should be some organizing that happens at the national level to press HUD to actually get done and spell out in more clear terms some of the things that are in the Biden housing plan currently, which are, you know, there's you know, discussions about ending redlining. What does that mean, right? About there is some language there about reparative housing, actually, and trying to figure out what that means and spelling that out in ways that actually make those things real, but also more investment in public housing, which we don't really have public housing for the most part in the United States anymore because it's all been defunded and being torn down and remade into market rate housing. And so just, you know, the basic idea of investing in public housing again would be absolutely revolutionary for people's lives. So funding, policy, you know, many places we have, in some places like Washington, D.C., which is often held up as, you know, the pinnacle of what's possible in terms of tenant rights. And, but, you know, those of us who work in Washington, D.C. know how many problems there are even in that system. But most places don't have tenant opportunity to purchase. They don't have rent control. So there's a basic funding problem, there's a basic policy problem, and there's a basic political will problem in most places to get many of these things in place. And to get housing policy And most of us live not in just localities, we live in metropolitan regions. And a lot of the housing policy that has happened is really segregated. So we're fighting for scraps in local communities when really we should be fighting at a regional level, but we don't have regional level governance, we don't have regional level tools to address many of the problems that we see in housing in terms of the concentration of poverty, in terms of the concentration of public housing, ending single family zoning. When is like the community that's actually single family zoned going to fight for that policy? So I think that we just need to organize at very broad levels around possible, things that are possible and at the table. And I think right now under, in the Biden administration, once it gets done right now, all it's simply trying to do is undo many of the Trump era policies that were horrible and horrifying for communities. But there is a real possibility of organizing around the potential for some of the things that are on the table. And if you're in your local community, chances are you don't have a lot of the same tools that are even in Washington, D.C. in terms of, tenant rights and other things like that. So there's lots of policies that you can be advocating for in your local communities, just because you need those tools in order to be able to fund them, in order to be able to organize around them. And that basic level of, policy isn't there in a lot of places.
So I guess I will be, I guess I'll just share an experience that might help to kind of get to where I see some of the roadblocks, I guess. So in, I guess maybe 2019, my colleague and I were invited to come and speak at a race and evictions in the Old Dominion event. And so we had just really started analyzing data and putting it next to a few key factors. And so what we started to show was, well, what initially we showed was that maps, right? So we showed the map of evictions, and then we showed the map of redlining, and then we showed the map of urban renewal. And then, we showed Ben's analysis that said that neighborhood racial composition, more than any other factor, double any other factor, was the leading driver of eviction in Richmond neighborhoods, and that held across the Commonwealth. And so what we were trying to say is, look, these things are connected. These things are deeply connected, and we explained these connections in ways. And the amount of angry pushback we got from a range of people. I mean, it was really unbelievable to us, the amount of pushback we got when we were saying these things, because these things are not things we talk about, right? Redlining is not in our high school textbooks typically. We're not talking about the impacts of urban renewal, or when you play connect the dots with Black neighborhoods in Richmond and destroy them all, which is definitely what happened in the mid-century in Richmond. And building a highway. Yeah, thank you. And so, when we really think about kind of the impact of that, the amount of pushback, because it's really hard for people to accept that there is something more to eviction, more to housing than just the legal notice, just the landlord's right to remove someone, just the sticks and bricks to put it up, or just the money to donate to it. Thinking about this larger structural understanding opens a can of worms that people are not comfortable with at all. And it's let me just tell you, over the past 2 years, that conversation has changed. So that is a really exciting thing, is that when we have these conversations in Virginia now, it's not immediately like, whoa, no, that's just wasting time. Why are we talking about this? I mean, truly, like that was the nice stuff that we got. Ben got the really ugly emails. But but so saying that, it sort of brings up a couple of pieces, and one is because housing for many white upper middle class people has been framed as a charity issue. And so you're welcome, you have a unit. And it is, so when you have that framework, there's not a responsibility beyond like what you would feel at your normal sort of, donating to, anybody, right? There's not sort of a real reason other than you happen to be a good person and you're donating. And so with that framework, it makes it really hard to talk about housing justice and housing as a justice issue. So that's one of the pieces, and related to that then is that the same people who are viewing housing as a charity issue are the ones who have access to philanthropic money. They have access to credit, they have access to politics. And so that sort of is an automatic flipping of, or sort of retention of power, and really a reproduction of all of this kind of power of whiteness. And so these are some of these barriers. And so I think actually what is happening in Charlottesville is really exciting, and what's happening in a lot of places. And I think to Willow's point, organizing is where we're at. We're not out of ideas in housing policy. We have all the ideas. Like, we really have experts out there with really great ideas and residents who know what they want. What we don't have is money and political will. And those things come together. And so I think to echo Willow's comments, we've got to be organizing at the local level, at the state level, and obviously nationally to push for more of this, to say, look, we need money at the local level. We need community control. We can't just have sort of developments coming into our neighborhoods and finding out after the fact that, by the way, there's going to be a casino here, which is what's going on in Richmond right now. We sort of can't have these kinds of after the facts, because that's not remotely justice oriented. That's just, you're welcome, we did a thing. So it just really denies the idea that people have any stake in their community. And of course, that's sort of all on a framing of usually the way we think about renters in our communities, and that they're transient, except that when I interviewed renters, typically they've been in the same unit for 15, 20, 42, 50 years, literally. It's intergenerational households in a building. And so these aren't people who are transient, who have no connection to their neighborhood. These are people who want to be here, who want to commit to their communities, but are typically excluded from the process. So I think that's all that to say is Willow really said it already. So I can be quiet now.
I do want to just underline something that Kate said here, which is really about changing the narrative about affordable housing. I think most people don't think about themselves, if they live in a single family home, as living in subsidized housing, but you are. You are a inheritor of the welfare system, because you are receiving a mortgage interest deduction, because suburbanization was underwritten by the federal government, and your low interest loan on your home is underwritten by the federal government. And so we really need to change the narrative around what affordable housing really looks like and who's the beneficiaries of that, in order to change some of the resistance that we see in community after community after community to the building of actually affordable housing for people who actually need it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we've had some success in Charlottesville with a couple of caveats to that. So we've recognized for a while, and I think we've built a good coalition of people around the idea that you mentioned single family zoning. Who's going to stand up for that? And through this effort to show racial covenants and racism, it's all the same thing, and our current zoning map reflects that, to get policymakers and decision makers to say, okay, we recognize that. So that was like our first step. And most of them do, right? I think the bigger hurdle to get over from there is really selling that to everybody and say, okay, that was wrong. What are we going to do about it? Let's change that. Let's flip the script on that. And I think we've had some success in Charlottesville getting that message out, though I can't say it's the majority of the people, because we have been going through this housing strategy process, and we're about to jump into totally rewriting the zoning code for Charlottesville, and we still haven't gotten over some of this. But I think we're making success. What we haven't done yet is seen how neighborhoods respond, right? We have in the past. We even saw a church try to build a tiny handful of homes for people with disabilities. And there was immense pushback for something that was just, talk about charitable, but it was also really great that the church was taking this on, but the neighborhood was just not down for it. And this is a community that says it really wants affordable housing for the most part. So when it gets into your neighborhood, we know we're going to have to fight. We fight those things day in and day out when we get the opportunities. But even with a policy shift, when that's in somebody's face, we have to deal with that. And I think we start by changing the narrative, by explaining, look, you don't really want to be a racist and participate in this racist system of zoning, do you? And make that something that people can understand they could actually do something about it. And we hope that will make things a little easier to swallow for the white community, the wealthier community. I really appreciated that comment about the zoning, because who is going to stand up for it? And honestly, it's about organizing. I think part of the success in Charlottesville is our organization, with help from others, we've been able to shut things down. We're really good at saying no. And I think the community's gotten really tired of that. And so when we came forward and said, here's what our vision for redevelopment is, people were like, okay, finally, these folks want to play ball. And we said, look, we're glad you're excited, but if you like this idea, then you're going to have to accept the decisions that come out of it. And that's been hard. But we're moving it forward, and it's getting better, to the point now that residents have really shown their expertise. You give people the tools, you give them all the information, they can make decisions, and they can do a damn good job of it. So we're showing that this idea of self-determination, it actually works. It gives you a good thing. And it's actually the only way it's going to get done in our community, is if it happens that way. Otherwise, we shut it down. And there's a lot of activists out there that they're also very good at that. The rest of it, I think, is really still difficult. And the way we deal with it is through organizing, building power, and then taking that power when it's time. Our organization had to go out and realize our positive vision. At first, it was like we were going to do this thing, and this was our expectations, and this is our vision. This is what we want. It still really wasn't getting there until we actually went out and did it, and we met with donors, and we met with anybody we could. To find out, we got very lucky, because you mentioned philanthropy and this idea of charity, and that being a holdup. And we got lucky that we were close enough with a very large donor who also has expertise in housing development. When we were looking for developer partners, we got very few responses to the RFPs, and we went and asked one of them, why is that? And some of them even turned us down after looking at it. So we had somebody come in and explain it to them. They said, there's no money in it. You can't do this without either a very large subsidy from the government or a very large subsidy from philanthropy. Unfortunately, we have that. Not every community has that. Not everybody has a Dave Matthews Band or Beyonce or, Jay-Z or somebody who can pony up the money for their communities. And that, I think we have to drive that home to local governments, to state governments, and to the federal government. I think that's a big one.
That's awesome. So you all have already begun to answer Claudia's first question. There's been some amazing questions. We now have 6 hours worth of awesome conversation to have, so I'm super excited. But just to state it in case there's more to add there, what can we do to defeat NIMBYism in Charlottesville?
I mean, I'd appreciate an outside perspective on this. Honestly, it's difficult. I'll give you a really strange example. So, a couple years back, property owner wanted to renovate his homes where there were some very long-time residents. One of them lived there for 40 years. They were paying rents very, very low compared to the market. Yes, the apartments did need some work, but as a result, he basically made everybody move out. Some moved out on their own, some were more forced, and it was a disaster. And we fought hard. It's actually something I think we should have been able to win. We could have fought harder. And jump ahead a couple of years, same guy, same property wants to build new stuff, so he's asking for a special use permit to build additional housing there. And we were like, all right, screw this guy. We're gonna shut this down. But we were contacted by people in the neighborhood who really also didn't want to see that happen, but also because of this NIMBY thing, right? And we were very hesitant to engage with those. So it was nice to know what they were up to and know that they also were opposed to the special use permit. But a long-term effort with folks in that neighborhood would be counterproductive when it comes to affordable housing and resisting gentrification. So I think it's really difficult. I've seen it in Charlottesville for a long time. I bought into it for a long time as well. You know, the neighborhoods want neighborhood control, and that's what we want for our communities, right? But some communities have more power than others and more access to political power and decision making. And if they say no, then they say no. Other communities don't necessarily have that unless they organize. So I still don't really know. I know, you know, look at North Downtown. My dream is to someday have the Greenbrier neighborhood or the Hilltop neighborhood have subsidized housing integrated in these extremely wealthy neighborhoods. I think we could do that through zoning and stuff, but how do we actually fight people fighting back? I think we have to teach, we have to continue to paint the racist history of Charlottesville and say, look, we have the opportunity to do something about it. We know you love your neighborhood. We know you love how it is, but, you know, do you really want to exercise that privilege, you know, from now until eternity? Or do you want to make, you know, the right things happen for our society and address this racism, this historical racism, and change the course of history in this town? It's a hard message, but I think we have to carry it as much as we can all the time.
Yeah, so I agree in part, you know, so I brought up this question about changing the narrative in, actually Kate brought it up about changing the narrative in, you know, wealthy, whiter, single family neighborhoods. And I do think that's part of the story, but I wouldn't put my chips in that basket. I'm not a big believer of changing hearts and minds. I think hearts and minds change when structures change, which means policy has to change, which means you got to have political will and change the policy. And when the policy changes, then people will fall in line and, oh, you have low-income housing next to you. You're going to have a neighbor that looks different than you, and you're going to learn to be neighborly, right? And all of a sudden your heart and your mind will change. And so I think we spend way too much time placating, you know, these wealthy neighborhoods, and we just need to figure out how to change the policy. You know, in Washington, D.C. right now, the mayor has this thing about spreading affordable housing into every ward of the city, and no surprise, you know, those west of Rock Creek Park are all up in arms. And I went to some of the community meetings with the planning department trying to, you know, talk about the history of redlining, urban renewal, segregation in the city, and how, you know, how harmful this has been. And let's talk about the cost of segregation to the city and how many lives have been lost and how much potential and economic growth. And they, for the most part, they don't care. They still want their neighborhood, and they don't want affordable housing in their neighborhood. So, I mean, the question of sort of where we put our limited energies and organizing, to me, is on building the political will for policy changes that honestly don't need everybody to agree. Not everybody in America agrees that Black people should receive reparations. The vast majority of people don't, actually, but Black people should receive reparations. Like, it's a moral, it's a just thing to do. And if we are housing justice advocates, then we fight for those policies. And it's great if people come along and we explain and we educate along the way, but waiting for that to be, you know, a policy consensus, you know, or you know, people activating around that is just too long, and maybe not ever, right? But when the policies change, people do change because they see their self-interest lying elsewhere. And I think we need to change that framework.
Yeah, Willow, I think after those meetings, they got all upset with you for making them feel bad, if I remember right.
The headline was the next, you know, the planners, you know, next strategy is to appeal to liberal guilt. Right?
Yeah. I mean, so I was actually going to use one of the examples of DC as well, with the homeless shelters, the emergency shelters that the mayor decided they were going to go in all 8 wards. And there was pushback in various ways, but the real pushback was in the same neighborhood where Willow was doing these talks. And they sued, and it really took the judge saying, no, stop it, you're racist. Before, like, you know, and so now all 8 shelters have opened, and there's all sorts of other issues around that system. But it really took kind of the legal piece being very, very clear. And I think that's a really excellent point, Willow, is that you're not going to convince folks. I was kind of racking my brain. I was like, how would we get NIMBYs involved? I don't know, but like, because it's not a rational thought. I mean, right? Like, you can walk around various neighborhoods where you are, and you find a Black Lives Matter, you know, placard next to a you know, keep our neighborhood single family, essentially. And there's no sort of understanding the cognitive dissonance that's going on there, right? And so I think we aren't thinking about that. It's not necessarily a rational decision, because we know there's like study after study, right? However you want to go, right? Hearts and minds of, like, you know, appealing to liberal guilt, you know, as it were. But, you know, financially, there is no financial downside to density, to any of these things, right? There's study after study that proves this. So none of it is rational. And so you're having an argument, you're coming armed for bear, and they're like, bears? What? And they aren't really even interested. So, you know, so I think that's a really important point. It's just like there is limited funding, limited time, limited energy for organizing, and let's put it where it really needs to be, which is building power, and not sort of asking for pieces.
That's awesome. So you all have just brought in 3 more questions. So I'm not stopping the conversation. I'm just going to lob these other ones up to you as a part of this. So Frank and Michael have asked us to start thinking about regional coalition building. And then Michael actually addresses Brandon in particular, wanting to know how has FAR built power so successfully, and for Willow and Kate, how has research and data been used as a part of that? So just lobbing them in.
I'll jump in real quick on the regional piece, just because I think it's interesting. I think Willow put this out there earlier, is that we don't have structures for regional cooperation by and large, because the structures that make regions cooperate, they're money, right? So like part of why we have regional transit authorities is because they've got money they've got to all kind of deal with. Housing is equally dependent as transportation, and there's no money involved for that. And so I think that's a big piece of it. I think an exciting thing to watch is in Richmond, the Partnership for Housing Affordability did indeed kind of pull together all the regional partners and developed a framework for housing affordability in the region. And it involves significant region-wide community engagement. I think it's an interesting framework, and there's a hope that works, but there's no real teeth to it, right? So you kind of have to agree to it. And even recently, what I think an interesting development in Northern Virginia and the DC region is the HAND, which I think the Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers just created a new tool to track affordable housing completion in the region. And I think when I sent that to some partners in Richmond, they're like, I can't believe that the local legislative folks agreed to it. But they did. And I think there's something there, right? That they actually agreed to be tracked, to be followed up with, because it's got to be regional. And so I think there's got to be leadership that pulls folks together. I don't know there's a magic bullet other than actually getting people to sit in a room for years, because right, we talked about this when I worked for Washington DC, like the DC housing department in 2007, 2009, we were talking about that. It took 13, 14 years for something to actually come out of it. So it's a time, I think for regional things, it's a time problem, and then there's a turnover problem. But I think there are some interesting pieces to watch, even in places where there aren't sort of sticks to force it.
Brandon, do you want to speak any more about the way FAR builds its power and maintains its power?
I can. We've gone through waves at FAR. I think what Willow and Kate were discussing a few minutes ago about the hearts and minds issue really kind of shows where FAR is coming from and why organizing is important, right? Because one thing we share with our resident interns is organizing and winning are really what you want to do, right? So it's fine if I want a decision maker to change their heart and change their mind about whatever, and maybe they'll make a good decision, but that's not why we organize. We organize to make them do what we want them to do. And I think that approach from FAR has always worked for us. As I mentioned before, a lot of what we've done has been shutting down bad things. Previous to that, it was really just organizing on small things and showing that we could have an effect to the point that we were very strong. We were at war with the housing authority for a number of years. It was bad, but we showed that we could get people out. They were smart. We could take over City Hall. We could protest evictions, and we would attach those activities towards actual policy changes. And we would win, and we would win, and we would win, and they couldn't do anything as long as we were in their way. So at some point, they had to just accept us or quit. And so, yeah, there was a lot of quitting, and we kind of turned the page with the housing authority. Now, the housing authority is still fairly weak. We've had a similar approach with the city, but we've been able to show that we're smart, that we have the numbers, we can shut it down if we have to, but we'd rather get out there and educate and get people to the table, take the table, and do the work ourselves. And that, it's still hard for people to do, but it's constant organizing. It's constant getting people together to make a plan that gets you from point A to point B and get what you want, and demonstrating that you're going to get what you want. And that helps you maintain power for a while. You can coast on that a little bit. been a while since we've had a march in the streets or something like that. But that memory that we have that ability is still there. And I think that carries us a little ways.
And I would just add on the organizing front that, you know, part of what we're organizing for is to not have to organize again, right? It's to try to change leadership, to try to change structures, to get better landlords, to get better housing policy, right? To get better city council members, to get better people on the planning board, so that, you know, some of these decisions are not always to just in the hands of residents to organize and organize and organize and organize. And those who are bearing the brunt of these policies don't have time to be in the streets all the time. So we have to think about really building, when we talk about building power, we're also talking about changing structures and how we put in place people in the right positions of power that can help to leverage those. And also how we build permanent associations. You know, like tenant associations, a lot of places don't have tenant associations that can speak their interest, right? And so just building and organizing at that level is really valuable to have a common voice to speak to and listen to. And so, I mean, there's a place to begin to build those structures of power in any community.
That's awesome. Okay, I'm going to ask Elisa to unmute and ask her question, because I'm close enough with her to do that, and also her question's awesome. Elisa?
Turn on my video too. So yeah, I had a question about, I've been finding some new planning research on kind of what you were talking about, Brandon, about flipping the script about the narrative about housing. And there are a few people talking about like how we always concentrate on like racially concentrated poverty, but arguing for kind of changing focus to what they're calling racially concentrated areas of influence. So thinking about like wealth hoarding as problematic. And I'm just wondering, from, because all you all have so much experience kind of being in the thick of like kind of trying to shift narratives, if you have tried either to decision makers or to the general public kind of reframing in terms of wealth hoarding, and like if you have, what the effects, like does it work? Have you tried it? Like, what have your experiences been around that? Because I think it's a really interesting shift that I hadn't even thought of, because I was so kind of in the literature that looks at concentrated poverty and those kinds of issues.
We've worked on that issue a lot. There's two pieces to the deconcentration of poverty thing. One is sort of the data and the results and things like that, and the effect it has on communities and people and stuff like that. And then there's this other sort of philosophical approach that's like, you know, you bring in wealthier, whiter people, AKA better people, and you're going to get better as a result. And you know, they never look at, well, you haven't actually invested in this community needs itself, the supports that this community have is really important. And we fought that battle in the strategic investment area in downtown Charlottesville, to the point where we crushed the idea. We have to always raise the issue, because it's always raised by somebody, or a consultant, or somebody comes in and they start talking about it. Look, we've had the conversation. Your data is questionable. We can talk about making rich people cry. One of our CLIHC members definitely did that to a landowner, a fairly big landowner in Charlottesville, around these questions of deconcentration and some other stuff. You have to shut down both sides of the argument, which says we can counter your data. We can show you that there's a different strategy to deconcentration. We can show you what happened in Atlanta and how deconcentration there was a disaster for people. We can show you the numbers for how many people were dispersed and lost, you know, in this process. We can show you that, okay, yeah, your educational outcomes improved, but there's so many less people in the neighborhood now. You can counter all that. And once you do that fiercely, I think you have to confront it head on every time with with some numbers, with some experience. And then you can say, okay, so that means we can set that aside, that data-based argument. You can set that aside and say we reject that. And now all you're dealing with is this weird philosophy of better people in your neighborhood. And screw that, we don't want that. And you can just say, we don't agree with you on that. There's nothing to really fight on. Once you can do that, you've at least made it clear. I think we've had success on that. Now, it doesn't mean anybody's changed. You know, you get out there and you say, we need to deconcentrate wealth. How about that, right? People don't really go for it. You get a lot of people in support of you when you say stuff like that, but the people it's directed to, they're not going to buy it. So you have to take it, and you can make your intentions clear, I think. That might provoke some backlash. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
It might provoke some backlash, but maybe some really productive backlash, because I think that this argument is absolutely right. We have spent so much time in housing policy sort of thinking about poor people, poor neighborhoods, segregated neighborhoods, and that as the problem. The problem is not poor people. The problem are the structures that make people poor. And that is white flight. That is capital disinvestment out of those neighborhoods and where it's going to, not what's left behind from those processes. And so if we don't pinpoint the problem over there, then we're not addressing the source of the problem. We're constantly in the community development, affordable housing world scraping for dollars. And we're always saying, like, we're relying on foundations and philanthropy. This is not like, it's not a mystery where we've gotten these problems, and it's not a mystery who's benefiting from them. And we don't talk about deconcentrating wealth, and we don't talk about breaking up those neighborhoods. Instead, in housing policy, we talk about moving poor people out of their neighborhoods to areas of opportunity and breaking up their social networks into neighborhoods in which likely they can't access the opportunity that's there in the same way that wealthy people can. But it's all about, housing in wealthier neighborhoods as the ideal. But does that really benefit poor people? Does it really benefit poor neighborhoods? Right? And so I think we do need to change the conversation, but back to the question of changing hearts and minds versus changing policy, we need to change the conversation in order to change the focus of policy. So we are also tackling breaking up those neighborhoods. This is the first time we've been having conversations about ending single family zoning, which has always been a subsidy to rich people, to white people. And now we're just beginning to have that conversation. But how long have we been talking about the culture of poverty, about, about single mothers and the welfare queens? I mean, those are generational conversations, and we're just now seeing a piece of what it might look like to have the other side of that conversation.
Yeah, I recently was talking to some fair housing folks about this, and they on and on and on deconcentrating poverty. And I was like, well, so what we need to be doing is connecting this conversation about redlining that fair housing people know chapter and verse, to understand that, like, essentially redlining created these neighborhoods that we're now saying they're toxic, they're terrible, you got to move. So we created this problem, blamed poor people for that problem, and then said the only way that you can get away from this problem is to move. And I think that that's what's so just sort of mind-boggling to me, is that we sort of have, again, cognitive dissonance, as we are like, don't quite make that connection of like, no, we actively disinvested in these neighborhoods. And then once you do move, those who were left in the neighborhood get dinged even harder, because there's population decline and there's vacancy, which leaves open the door for increased speculation, which increases the possibility of gentrification and additional displacement. And so it's like this whole cycle that we keep repeating over and over again. And I think people don't quite take that step back to say, wait, what's behind this? I mean, I think aside from the white middle class fairy dust that we all sort of rub around to make things better, which is completely batty. There's also Yeah, sorry, Willow. There's also just this sort of ignoring of the fact that we created the problems that we're now saying, well, you got to get out of them. Well, you know what? We created them. I'm pretty sure we can work to uncreate them. And that involves actually investing in neighborhoods, and that involves investing in community-based organizations that know their neighborhoods. This is not, it's not rocket science, but we seem to sort of have this sort of weird view that in fact you can't have a strong Black neighborhood, you can't have a strong working class neighborhood. Well, like working class neighborhoods were actually pretty darn functional for a real long time. So I think that's a piece that we're sort of, we come in with a very sort of, again, the top-down piece. And I think somebody asked questions about data, and this is where sort of research and data that's grounded in experience really matters. I think Willow talked about kind of community networks and the importance of those. Well, yeah, this matters. And when you actually listen to people talk, it really makes a huge difference. And so I think that's something that's been really key. And so it's exciting to talk about that. Great question. But I think deconcentrating wealth is one that I love, but it does not get a lot of traction. I think it's an important conversation to have, and it's great to flip the script, but I don't know how far we get with that.
This is amazing. Y'all are the best. So we have two last questions that I want to just throw up in case you can like popcorn good ideas. I was hoping to give Frank and Harrison the mic, but we don't have enough time for that because we had too many wonderful nuggets. So Frank is bringing up the pledge that UVA has made to produce 1,000 to 1,500 units, and wondering about unintended consequences of such things. And then Harrison is asking about additional land value taxes to incentivize landlords to be more open to upzoning. So last thoughts around either issue from our esteemed guests.
I'd love to chime in on both, really. I'll take Frank's question first. CLIHC had spent some time really harping on UVA. UVA doesn't pay taxes. And has a huge impact on our housing situation. What they do have is land, right? And I've been in some meetings and made comments to the tune. I did put a dollar figure on it. I don't recall what that number was, but there's been a lot of pressure on UVA about housing, and I think Jim Ryan saw that and is trying to do something. The unintended consequence in my mind is they don't know what they're doing, and they're tasking out this effort to a developer who's probably going to go the same tried and true tax credit route. You can't blame them. That's how things get funded. They're offering up their land. I think they could be more creative with how they use their land so that they can bring rents down for the housing that they build. Because whoever comes in and does it, they're going to do the LIHTC thing. They're going to juggle out the numbers, and they're going to learn what we learned a while back, which is there's no money in it if you're trying to serve extremely low income people. I think that's the biggest issue with what they have going on. Now, they've got community partners working on this. They have smart people working on this. I think they can avoid it. I think there's more they can do, but they're going to have to do some work, and it's something that really worries me about that process. But I do think it's genuine, and the fact that they're saying we have this land, we can do something with that is a big step. The community is still not going to trust UVA. It's got too much history here. It's Jefferson's plantation. You know, they have to humbly get out there and do the work. And I really hope that they do. The other was on landlord incentives through taxes. I'm not a fan. We've learned this over the years here. Trying to develop a housing strategy, looking at form-based code, looking at different zoning things, the SUP process, how can we incentivize a landlord to do the right thing? It just doesn't work. Because there are already some incentives there. And if they can't make the money work, they can't. I think if a landlord really wants to do something and they want any kind of public support, public money into something, they have to pony up a lot in return. And I don't think most aren't going to be interested, which is why I think, focusing on improving housing authorities, sticking up for public housing, not allowing it to be completely decimated. I think there's value in doing that. There's value in pushing for subsidies from the public into nonprofits so that they can do the right thing because they're mission driven rather than profit driven. I don't see incentives as being terribly effective. I think what it does is it's a giveaway to people who might already be thinking about doing something anyways.
Thanks so much. Kate, Willow, last thoughts?
I just have never known landlords building owners not to be looking for density. Like that's usually not the issue. They're usually begging for more density, but don't really want to deal with the change in dealing with like upzoning or anything like that, variances and whatnot, because it takes them time. So they're going with kind of what's going to make the most money and be the least resistance.
Yeah, and if you raise taxes, they pass it on to the tenants. If you upzone, as Kate is saying, you are actually creating wealth and value for the landlord. So what you have to make sure to do is capture that wealth and value and redistribute. So it's not just a subsidy to the landlords who generally, if you upzone, you're raising the value of that property. So landlords don't need that, tenants need that. And how do you make sure that that's captured and redistributed in a way that makes sense for communities?
Right on. I'm grateful to all of you. I'm grateful to SPA. Thank you for I'm grateful to be in Charlottesville with awesome activists like Brandon and everyone at CLIHC. So thanks for being with us tonight.